we have the session here because when we talk about outreach and collaboration, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes the outreach and collaboration that we need to do is with the people sitting right next to us in our own organizations, not necessarily with the outside, but that's also true. To be effective in what we're doing, to achieve what we want to achieve, just like we talked about trust and communication earlier, there's a ton of trust and communication that needs to be developed with the communities and the individuals that we're working with. Okay? I think it's fair to say that a collaboration or a partnership approach to what you're doing is not something that you put in place in the first 6 months like you had on your plan, and then it just runs by itself for the whole course of the project. These are living, breathing, dynamic entities that actually require tending to. Right? Trust is part of the relationship. Communication is part of the relationship. So these relationships change. They go through ups and downs. Different things happen at different points in time, and if you don't pay attention to them, you're going to lose something. Okay? And again, resistance to change is not uncommon. We will experience it. We'll experience it with our collaborations as well. And so it's important to anticipate what some of these changes might be, what some of these problems might be, and how to effectively manage collaboration problems in the course of these projects. So we're going to hear from Hildy, and then we're going to hear from one of our colleagues, Rick Pender, from Winston-Salem, who has been working at collaboration for as long as I've known him, and he's got some real-life, on-the-street stories to share with us about how these concepts really work in the field. So, Hildy?
Thank you, Chip. Can everybody hear me? I don't wear a tie, so I couldn't put the pin on my tie, so I decided to stand here and talk with the microphone. So we are hoping this session will broaden your perspective on community outreach and collaboration and encourage all of you to develop a more comprehensive outreach effort that becomes integral to your smart policing initiatives. Now, two things strike me from yesterday's discussions, and I wanted to start with those. First, the need to balance your data-driven analyses and data-driven strategies with an understanding of the community context in which these crime problems are occurring. A lack of community participation or input or understanding could in fact result in a sort of backlash or reduced community support, particularly among communities, and frankly it's oftentimes minority communities, which so often are the hardest hit by place-based strategies and intensive enforcement. This in turn could impact your policing effectiveness. Second, we ought to learn to take short-term crime reductions and turn them into real long-term sustainable successes. Here we could take a lesson from the public health playbook. The public health field is especially good at using prevention strategies, public education, data, and scientific analysis to change social norms within a community and address those safety issues too. One need only think of stop smoking, seatbelt use, drunk driving campaigns, and their subsequent changes in public attitudes and even public changes in behavior to understand the actual power of community outreach and collaboration. Larry from Lansing brought up this issue yesterday, and I second the importance of it. So let's get to the nuts and bolts. There are numerous examples of law enforcement programs and strategies that have actually embraced community outreach and collaboration. A few of them are listed up here in recent years. But they've all proven that outreach and collaboration do in fact increase the likelihood of a program's success and its long-term viability. To understand the relationship between outreach and collaboration, you can think of a continuum of community linkages between the police and the community. And at one end of this continuum is outreach. Now, these are ways, and often very simple ways, at this end of the continuum, in which police actually connect with their stakeholders or connect with residents. And this can be very simple things like community meetings, press conferences, public service announcements, etc. But at the other end of this continuum is collaboration, which is a highly developed model or process for multiple agencies, stakeholders, and residents to come together and work on a very complex social issue like crime and violence. Now there are four key elements to community outreach, and if all of these are employed in your efforts, then you would have a fairly comprehensive outreach program. First is communication. In this context, communication means much more than just information sharing. It's a two-way process where each side listens, responds, and becomes engaged in the effort. Second is consultation, where asking for stakeholder input is paramount. And in return, you receive buy-in and support for your program. Third is coordination, where agencies and organizations working on this effort actually share information and resources, of course, to gain some efficiencies and reduce duplication. And fourth is the collaboration aspect. This element presents the greatest opportunity to bring together organizations and all the stakeholders involved in your program for sharing the commitment and as well as sharing the responsibility for the program's implementation and outcome. So how can you reach out to community members effectively? Well, it depends on your objective somewhat, but here are some techniques to consider as you move along. A first step might be community education. So consider social marketing campaigns, media campaigns, newsletters, websites, and community events. Now up here behind me on the purple wall is an example of a social marketing campaign that we ran in several high-risk neighborhoods in Phoenix as a part of our Project Safe Neighborhoods. And the idea was to use a variety of communication techniques to achieve massive messaging. This was to saturate the community with a key message: keep your family safe, stop gun violence. And our vehicles were numerous. We used press conferences, billboards, flyers, community events, school-based programs, youth leadership development, a gun buyback, which garnered amazing media attention. All to really achieve a couple of goals: to educate the community on gun violence, to empower the community to get involved in prevention, and to really change attitudes about violence and or using violence as a way to resolve conflict. We wanted to change those community norms around that topic. And I don't have time to go into more detail now, but if you'd like to come up at break or different times during the day and take a close look at some of these materials and how our campaign unfolded, I'd be happy to discuss them. So let's move on. If you want to reach out to minority or marginalized groups, you ought to consider bilingual communication, working with community leaders that already have established trust with your residents, or partnering with trusted organizations in the community. If you want to consult with stakeholders and residents, then consider focus groups, community surveys, community meetings, and forums. You may want to form short-term partnerships that meet specific objectives. So you may form a steering committee or an ad hoc group with a beginning and an end date. But the point is to bring together the right group of stakeholders to reach an intended outcome. And you ought to link all of these efforts to sustainability. When forming a partnership or a collaboration, consider who can help you sustain the program beyond the life of the grant, or who can bring those long-term resources to the table. And I wanted to mention one other technique that's not on the screen, but that's community meetings. And sometimes when we think about police and outreach to the community, we think community meetings. But don't let these drive your outreach and then be disappointed when residents don't show or very few show. What you really ought to consider are multiple strategies and multiple ways for reaching out to residents It can be as simple as changing a community meeting to a monthly barbecue, because there's nothing like food to bring residents out. But it could also be linking and piggybacking onto existing events or existing programs in your communities. So link with community festivals, community picnics, movie nights in the park were extremely successful for us in Phoenix. Existing neighborhood association meetings, existing block watch meetings, those sorts of things. So let's move on to collaboration. There's really 10 characteristics that you need to implement in order to have the greatest success. I'm going to talk about just a couple of those. Visioning in particular is critical to a collaboration. Everyone at the table should understand the vision, should share that vision, and as someone said yesterday, own that vision. Strong leadership is also critical, but not hierarchical leaders. So consider a shared leadership, that an agency representative with the right skills really mentors perhaps a resident who doesn't have leadership skills now to develop them over time. Develop a diverse membership in your collaboration with all the stakeholder groups represented at the table. A member-driven agenda will give the members a key voice and keep them engaged in the process. And members are more likely to stay engaged when they have a role in decision-making and when they feel a part of something that's actually new or truly innovative. So let's talk about some of those roadblocks that you confront sometimes with collaboration. Probably many people have faced in the past, or may very soon. First and foremost, you want to consider, do you have the right people at the table? Both traditional and non-traditional stakeholders in law enforcement. Now, all of the groups up here on the screen are good groups to consider as you develop a collaboration. They all have interests in policing and crime reduction. But some groups in particular, you need to consider a few issues. Resident groups and residents, oftentimes difficult to bring to the table. But when you do identify those residents, do you offer them leadership training? Do you offer them mentoring so that they can feel they're an equal partner at the table and have an equal voice in the process, when oftentimes they just don't have the skills the agency representatives have? Help grow community leaders, where perhaps you have none in your neighborhood right now, but you could help grow those leaders. Also bring in faith-based groups. They often have those linkages to residents that can help bring them to the table. Oftentimes nonprofits do as well. And schools can be a critical stakeholder, particularly if you're going to focus on prevention strategies. Reaching out to youth before they get into that 16 to 24 crime-prone age group can be very critical, and having schools there can help you do that. And consider a rather non-traditional stakeholders, I mentioned earlier, public health officials. They often bring fresh perspectives to the table as well as new data. And particularly if you're addressing gun violence or drug abuse issues. And gunshot injuries and other violent injuries take up valuable resources in trauma centers and emergency rooms and hospitals. And so they can be a valuable asset when you're developing violence reduction strategies. Also, when you have a lot of people involved in a collaboration, it's more important than ever to have a structure for how you're going to get the work done and who's going to do it. So consider establishing committees, having a coordinator, developing a strategic plan, and giving out work assignments. Team building really does matter in these large groups. They can help break down territorial feelings and get people working together. Put rules and guidelines in writing so everybody knows the expectations of each other. Hold effective meetings. This is one of the critical things for success. Every meeting should involve decision making. This is what keeps people engaged and keeps them coming back. And finally, know the right time to bring in partners. If you bring them in too early and without the proper background and work, oftentimes the group may move in a different direction than you actually intended. But bring them in too late and they don't feel they have a say and they don't feel like they were a real partner in the process. So lots of things to consider. Let's put these learnings into context now with Rick Pender giving you some examples in practice. Well, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Billy. Good morning. Several weeks ago, Chip contacted me at the center and asked if I would talk a little bit about some of my real-life experiences or some of the real-life experiences in Winston, working with law enforcement agencies and also working with the community. So I'm going to talk both about successes and failures. And I've got to be like Detective French. I've got to be a little careful when I'm talking about the cops. As you were talking about the researchers, I've got to be careful talking about the cops because I rode in a car up with them. And tomorrow, that's my plan of action to get home. Is riding with the cops. So I'll politically be cautious as I step around that. But in 1998, the Department of Justice brought its SAXI initiative to the Middle District of North Carolina, to Winston-Salem. And of course, most of it was copied after the Boston Gun Project. Also, when it came to Winston, it also came to High Point, which is a community located about 20 miles from Winston. And Chief Kiosk was over the police department at that time. But what was unique, and both of the communities, we were really trying to build the same type working groups. A lot of the same components were being built in High Point and being built in Winston-Salem. So what's interesting, it gave us a very unique opportunity to learn from High Point, and High Point would learn from Winston-Salem. We were building very similar strategies. And then, of course, we had researchers at the table, so we were able to learn from what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong through some case studies. But we were also, just geographically, so close to High Point, anecdotally, we would talk about lessons learned between our two communities. But in Winston, our partnerships in the community, they're still very active, as with High Point, they're still very active and really supporting the law enforcement strategies. And in Winston, we were able to build out really three interrelated objectives. And it was support law enforcement, challenge the community to action. Bill Cobb, Captain Cobb really liked this piece because we were able to get action out of the community, but also hold them accountable. And Cobb's like, you mean a cop gets to hold a community person accountable for work? It's like, yeah, we're going to try. We're going to try to do this. Then the third piece is complement a larger community and change process. We work with the cops in several communities, all in the high crime neighborhoods, as well as really in some more upper end type communities with breaking and entering and other violent crime similar to that. But what we found out by working in all these communities, each community has norms and narratives. I believe Larry mentioned that yesterday in his presentation. And it's very important really to try to understand what that narrative sounds like. And a lot of our high-risk communities, those norms and those narratives, they run contrary to our mainstream beliefs. So you can't let those norms and narratives go unchecked. For example, some of the norms in one of our communities, it was a public housing community, fairly large size public housing community for Winston-Salem, had a 30-year history of an open-air drug market. And the residents, some of the residents in this community, their narrative, or the norm in the community was that it's okay to sell illegal drugs. It's a viable source of income for our family. That really kind of runs against some of our mainstream beliefs. Some of the narratives, in this public housing community, it had 179 units, 200 units, 97% of the tenants in this community were young black females, head of household. Their narrative that had been built over the past 30 years and was handed down to their kids. I mean, these narratives and these norms get handed down. They were saying that the cops, all they want to do is come in our community and lock up our young black males. I mean, this was really a belief that they had. So we couldn't let that message go unchecked. We had to check the message. And you can do that, or we did it, by finding the moral voice in a neighborhood. Hildy and I were talking about this yesterday. There are moral voices in every neighborhood. Sometimes you can't hear them. They get overshadowed by the rhetoric and the negative rhetoric. But there are moral voices. You've got to find those moral voices, and you've got to get them into your partnership, and you have to empower them and give them a platform to help support that moral voice. It could be a minister, it could be a supervisor that works in a youth center, supervisors that have been there 20 years and has helped raise 3 generations of kids. Those are the folks that have the moral voice that you can bring to the table. Also, talking about these champions. I've heard champions mentioned several times. You've got to get the authentic partner to the table. And I borrow this term authentic from David Kennedy, John Jay. He likes to talk about the authentic partner, the authentic stakeholder. They're there for the right reasons. You have to be careful who you bring to the table, because if they're there for the wrong reasons, if they have a hidden agenda, then it can really disrupt the partnership. It can really take the partnership off into the ditch. So you really have to find that authentic person, and you have to get them to the table. Working in communities, minority communities, culturally specific communities, communities of color. We were finding out that we would get in, we would start talking to the community, and all of a sudden somebody would throw the race card out on the table. Wow, at first it was catching us off guard. We were not prepared for that type of conversation, but we learned to go to these meetings with the community and be prepared for the race conversation. Several folks have talked about calls for service. We would use that data to take with us to these meetings, and the calls for service is such a good barometer of the temperature of crime in the community. We would use that data as a reason to be in that community, and we were able to check, and many times able to check that race card that would be thrown out on the table. And sometimes the conversations get very heated, get very argumentative. But the cops, you can't, or we can't let this type of heated rhetoric really get us off our intention of being there. So, unfortunately, you have to have these uncomfortable conversations with the community. But we found out, as we stayed at the table, We kept the community at the table. And we had these difficult conversations with the community. We kept coming back, the community kept coming back, and build that rapport with the community. You put action items out on the table, assign action items, accomplish the action items, and you start building trust. And that rhetoric really, the temperature of the rhetoric really comes down. And we can move forward then as a partnership. The media. Okay, I'm talking to the cops now. What police department has a love-hate relationship with the media? Let me see your hands. All of us. In the beginning, we were a bit standoffish with the media. I mean, we would bring them in. We would talk about our strategy. We would talk about our outcomes and outputs. Then the next day, you would open up the newspaper and you would read the article, and it's like, who did they talk to? They didn't talk to me, because this is not what we said. So, a lot of times that caused a rift with the media, and we were kind of standoffish.